What is the worst experience you have ever had with your neighbor? S. My neighbors had problems. They had constant nightly blowouts and physical fights. Together but not married. Still super on off. Dad was an alcoholic. Cops knew them by name. Once, when we were sleeping, 2 a.m. we heard the screaming and cries of their son, my little sister's best friend, and a minute later he's knocking on the door for my mom to help. She pulls him inside and a few minutes later the mom shows up. Bloody and beaten up. She asks my mom to lock the door and holds her son. She wouldn't call the police out of fear they'd take the son. So my mom pulled the couch out and made them a makeshift bed. Door locked. Food and coffee being made while my sister and the son slept while my mom spoke to her and they arranged something. About an hour after they'd showed up he starts kicking our door and screaming. The son is crying. The mom is holding him. My mom fights with him through the door for over an hour till he leaves. My mom arranged for a place for them to stay in a women's shelter an hour or so away and brought them there the next night after he thought they'd already left. She spent 2 weeks sneaking as much as she could to them. His school work. Anything till she found an apartment back locally and felt safe to come back. They're still on and off. No longer physically fighting. Though they both never stay at his house anymore. Just 3 days ago the neighbor's dog attacked my dog in the street. My dog was on a leash. The other dog wasn't and came charging at us and just like a hellhound attacked my dog. Being that the dog looked like a pit bull and was about 60 pounds. And I don't know if this thing has diseases and not wanting to risk getting bitten. I tried to shoot it. Just one shot and it ran away. I missed and the gunshot woke up the entire neighborhood. The owner came out yelling at me as if allowing my dog, or myself, to be ripped open would be the better choice. 3 cop cars showed up creating quite the show. Now I have to go to court Jan. 10th for discharging a firearm in city limits. I can't wait to go actually. 2 houses over. We were good acquaintances. Probably almost friends. The relationship had been going downhill pretty steadily for a while. Worked for the guy for a little bit. Last time this came up I talked about how he stood me up and never answered his phone door when agreeing to help me move my couch onto a trailer. So I have another example. He was my boss at the time this happened. I notice he's real big on using people's stuff when they aren't around. Used a guy's garage and table saw woodworking tools when he was gone. I told him multiple times. At least 5 times. Hey, I'm cool with you borrowing my stuff but just make sure you ask. I also don't like unscheduled visits. Call or text if you wanna stop over. Just to let him know where I stand if he wants to borrow some more tools from me or whatever. I had let him borrow a 17mm impact socket from me. 2 weeks go by and I assume the fucker probably lost it. Whatever. I won't agree to lend it out again. Well, after another few days he says, hey, you weren't home so I returned the socket and borrowed another. Yes. He hopped over my fence midday while I was gone. Opened my garage door. Returned the socket he borrowed. Very scratched and marred up. And helped himself to some of my other tools. He tells me all this a week after it happens. Out of the blue. As if it was no big deal. That was the breaking point after dealing with other shit from him. Told him to stay the fuck away from me. My house. My family. My property. We had a neighbor of ours, a retired police officer in his 50s, adorbal ditches for around a month. The crazy thing is we never knew it was him. Apparently he was mad at us because we had a dog that would bark and disturb. He never told us about this. So I don't feel too bad. He also keyed the car to one of my house guests at the time. Finally. One day before we were moving out. He doorbell ditched us. My wife and I looked at each dead in the eye and without a word I sprinted out the front door and she took off out the back. We had this unspoken thing where we were like, let's us trap this motherfucker. Sis, I'm more impressed and we did this and were so tight that we didn't need to say anything to one another. I caught up with our shirtless neighbor and he put his hands up and said, so gay. You got me. So I said, dude. What the fuck? Why are you doing this? He was drunk as all hell and then proceeded to tell me about my barking dog. He apologized and said he should have told us about it. It wasn't to do with me but my parents before they had children. When buying their first house, our current family home, they arrived on their motorbikes to view the house. After deciding on buying it, they greeted the neighbors. The neighbors expressed about how thankful they were that the biker couple didn't buy the house. Then proceeded to rant about their dislike towards bikers, not knowing my parents were the biker couple. As you can imagine, it didn't go down too well when the pricks noticed the bikes. Anyway, to the more interesting bit. A few months after their initial chat with the neighbors, my parents were sitting in the living room minding their own business when they heard an explosion. They ran outside to find both on their bikes engulfed with flames. They called the fire brigade, who put out the fire. One of the fire people approached my mom and pointed out that there were matches laying around and this was more than likely an arson attack. My mom didn't pursue it with the police for God knows what reason, but while in her fit of rage she told my dad whoever did this is going to break their right leg, coincidence or not. A week later the one neighbor came home with his right leg in a cast. Sorry if it's a bit long-winded and probably a bit boring. But hey, just thought I'd post it. And PLZ, mind my spelling or grammar, I'm very dyslexic. My neighbor sprayed our hedge between our houses with something that killed it, which we planted there next to her cyclone fence so we wouldn't have to look at her. Everything we've planted there dies. And they always start dying from her side. She's so super nosy and is always watching out the window, which is why we plant things there. She also moved her in-ground sprinklers onto what I think is our property, touching our driveway, and sets them to go off in the middle of the night when our cars are parked there. She refuses to set them to go off while we're at work because it interrupts her yard work time. So water spots on our cars are irrigation water, and leave huge white amoeba-shaped marks down one side of our car. I paid someone $250 last year to use acid to remove them and they were still faintly there. She actually had the nerve to suggest our son park his car there because the color of his car won't show the water spots as bad. Her husband walks up and down the backyard fence and whistles at our dog to make her bark. Then the wife complains to us about our dog barking. Our dogs are inside dogs, never outside for more than a few minutes at a time. These are not out there all day barking when we have a family member house sit. The neighbor complains about the number of cars in our driveway and parked in front of our house. Says she doesn't like looking at us used car lots. She's a real peach. So I live in Puerto Rico, where most of the island has been without power for the past 2 months following Hurricane Mare. Due to our government's power authority being quite slow in the recuperation process, a lot of neighborhoods in my area have been hiring private contractors to bring the electricity back. In my case, I found a contractor willing to bring our neighborhood's power grid back on. But I needed unanimous support from the neighbors to pay and authorize the process. Most were on board for this, but 2 of my next doors opposed it for some reason. When we asked why, they said that they wanted the neighborhood without power so the rest of us would eventually leave and they'd never have to see our annoying and pathetic faces again. So it was pretty much a no-go on the contractor. Fast forward a week and we find out that these next doors had a friend in the power authority who asked them to keep away private contractors from the neighborhood so the authority could take credit when power is eventually restored. TLDR. We almost had power back in the neighborhood, but neighbors fucked us over as a favor for a friend. One got the cops called on them because their oldest son was cracked out and got in a huge fight with the mom in the front lawn. Turns out, he was also wanted for armed robbery and aggravated assault. The cops got the wrong house and started banging on our house at 1 AM in the morning until my very irritated father pointed them to the real home. Not sure if that counts because it's indirect, but yeah, it was kinda tamer than the time the girl who lived in the other side of our duplex kicked her boyfriend out, but he was tweaking on PCP and literally threw their stove through the shitty wall that connected their kitchen to ours. Fun. They insisted that we pay to have a gate installed between our backyard fences so that they may use our above ground pool as they please, preferably when they invite friends over. When we denied, they threw a hissy fit and found an excuse to punish us. You see, The pool was going through some expensive issues with leakage into the yard. They threatened to call the fine happy hour because the water was barely leaking into their yard they rarely used and their dog was getting sick drinking the water. It wasn't. Not wanting to deal with that bullshit and also wanting to clean our own backyard of the pond that began housing frogs. My father spent his birthday day off from work in the Texas heat digging a trench and installing a pipe so that the water could drain. The neighbors came outside and harassed Dad the entire time he was digging the trench, telling him it would have just been easier to install the gate. Would have been easier to install a shovel into your frontal lobe. Fucking profligates. In the middle of the night strange noises would come from their apartment. Like an owl mating with a German shepherd. In another. If I breathed too heavily, they'd come up and ask me to be quieter. I once told them that I was literally sitting on the couch reading a book and had no idea what noise they thought they were hearing. Another burned something in his oven. Rather than open his windows to get the smoke out, he opened his door to the hall and set off the whole building alarms. We had to all stand out in the cold and wait for the fire department while he watched from his apartment. The fire department opened his windows and told him he was an idiot. We still had to wait outside for them to do mandatory checks of everything to make sure it really was just him being stupid. It was January. In New England. During a cold snap. Moved into a brand new house. Noticed an old toilet, garbage and a broken down hot tub in the neighbor's front yard. Okay. Made cookies for all the neighbors and went over to introduce ourselves. He laughed and slammed the door in our faces. Okay. Out landscaping our new yard with my husband and laying some bricks. Husband is on his knees making sure they are level while I stand and hand him the bricks. Neighbor walks by and yells swell. I can see who wears the pants. Husband and I look at each other perplexed. Okay. Get a puppy. Our other neighbor lets us know she witnessed the neighbor's grown son throwing lit cigarettes over the fence at our puppy when he was in the backyard. We found about 50 cigarette butts in our yard. We do not smoke. Then she also had to call the police because his other son broke the lights on her garage and defecated on her welcome mat, all captured by her home video system. About 6 months later get a complaint for dog barking with a $500 fine. It was ridiculous. Our dog never barked. Unless someone walked by or came to the door. We had letters from all 16 surrounding neighbors attesting that our dog never barked. What great neighbors we were and how crazy the complainant was. The letters were not admissible. Since there were 2 pathological adult sons and the neighbor's word against ours 2 sane working adults. We lost and had to pay. We sold the house and moved shortly afterward. We were trying to sell our house and the neighbor's meth head nephew was sabotaging it. When Wes odd leaves so people could come look at it, he would sneak around just being creepy. Which turned off a lot of buyers. He even went into my house during an open house and was telling people not to buy it. These people lived like 100 yards away and we still don't know what his deal was. Once he started threatening my sister who tried to help him after he passed out on my driveway. She's a nurse. We called the cops and he signed a paper that said if he was caught on the property again he'd be sent to jail. Luckily we were able to sell it after that. Lived on the top floor of a drug house in college because it was the only place that would let 7 of us rent together. The first week we were there the SWAT team did a raid on one of the units. There were 3 below us. They busted in the door and used flashbang grenades on them. One of the other units smelled like urine and constantly had people coming in and out buying drugs. Our keys barely fit in the lock because people had tried to pick them so much. Our cable internet stopped working so we called the cable company to come check it. The guy took us over to the box outside and showed us 9 different illegal lines that were ripping our internet. I could go on and on. On the plus side we could shoot bottle rockets in our hallway because it wasn't like anyone was going to call the cops on us. Lived above a guy in a really old fourplex and I guess the wood floor squeaked really loudly when I walked around. It's not like I was stomping around either but the dude would constantly come upstairs and bang on my door and yell at me to stop moving around. I felt badly for him in the beginning because he seemed genuinely frustrated but he didn't seem to understand or believe that I wasn't slamming my feet on my floor his ceiling. I called my landlord several times asking him if he had a solution. I couldn't move because I was locked into my lease, but my landlord was just like, buy a lot of rugs. It got to the point that I couldn't take the constant yelling and I was literally either tiptoeing around or hopping from my couch to my chair in order to get out of my living room so that he wouldn't be standing at my door yelling at me. Finally I went downstairs one day and asked if we could talk about the situation because I felt like maybe if I looked him in the eye when he was calm and explained that I wasn't doing it on purpose and that there was literally nothing more I could do. I had already bought Aries rugs FFS. He would maybe understand. So I went downstairs and very nicely explained and he seemed to be listening. And then he said, I'm about at the point that if it happens again I'm going to show up at your door with a really big knife. And then he just stared at me. I basically ran out of there. Called my landlord and said that I was more or less being threatened, and a month later the guy moved out. And then as soon as I could I did too. Super shitty situation. My hubs and I moved into our current neighborhood 11 years ago. We quickly became very close to the couple across the street. The wife soon became like a mother to me, as I had lost mine a few years earlier, or so I thought. I had an extremely traumatic childhood that has impacted my adult life with a variety of mental illnesses. PTSD being the most profoundly devastating. I had a series of really bad patches and my husband supported me and helped me get the help I needed. During these times the neighbor wife would watch our youngest child while hubs worked and would get him ready for school. About 1.1/2 years ago and during my current longest stretch of stability my son finally confided in me that she often told him I was a drug addict, some prescribed Ativan for my anxiety. And that I love his older sister more than him because mothers always love their daughters more. And that my father never abused me. She based that on the fact that they met and he seemed like a great guy. That I was cruel to my father for not letting him around the kids. He murdered my mother in 2002. Anyway, I flipped out. I said some pretty nasty things in anger. Mostly that she's lucky I didn't want to go to jail for punching her teeth down her throat. I tried to confront her when I calmed down, but she refuses to even look at me, let alone have a conversation. My kids used to play with her grandchildren. She has custody because their mom is a drug addict, but now she makes them come inside if my son tries to play with them. My hubs and her hubs still get along, and he was actually over here this morning to talk to my husband about a project they are working on together. He was very polite to me. But yeah. It was strained. I dream about her sometimes. That we are friends again and hang out. Like I said previously, I looked up to her as a mother figure. It makes me sad that she said those horrible things to my son and now it's so awkward for everyone. I live in a 6 apartment building in Nick. Born and raised. And if you are from NY you can legit go 10 years without seeing neighbors. But when you see each other it's very cool and civil. This new chick moved in and is trying to be the mayor of the building. Asking me if I have weed or random shit like an extra Amazon Fire Stick laying around. And is overall very intrusive. Like every day. Stalking me in the hall when I have company over. This one time she invited herself to my living room and sort of walked in and sat down to eat her food, and I just started at her with astonishment. I wasn't alone. My boy came over to watch Thursday night football. I flipped the fuck out. I have done nothing to lead her on. I'm a very reserved person, so I felt a little bad, but my home is for chilling the fuck out. Not for getting stressed. I pretty much told her. This is not a goddamn dorm room. I pay rent for peace of mind and to be left alone. Not to have people pry into my life and ask me for random shit. Neighbor had a grumpy dog with heart issues. We had 3 puppies who were in the process of potty training. He'd freak out if we let ours outside while his was out. And his was almost always out. If they gotta go, they gotta go. So they were all out pretty often. At first we tried to be understanding. As all the dogs would bark and run, and his dog had a chance of heart attack if he got too wound up. We'd always be out with them. Distracting them and getting them used to his dog. He'd only come out to yell at us. Never once tried to comfort his dog or take him inside. Came to heads one day when neighbor threatened with, if he gets through that fence I'm not stopping him. He'll tear those little shits up. My so responded, if he gets through that fence, I'll just call mine inside. Pat your poor dog who could obviously use a little love. Then tear you up. Neighbor picked up a shovel and started over. So picked up a rock and nailed the shovel almost out of his hand. Smiled and walked inside saying, "You don't scare me, bud. You're as harmless as your dog, just needs a little love. Sorry your mom didn't hug you as a child." Double quote. Never had an issue again. Dogs get along fine now. His dog loves us more than him. Our dogs are now 3 times the size of his and we secretly don't yell at them if they bark at him. About a decade ago we met our future next door neighbors in an area where my family was gonna build our new house. They were nice enough at first but changed drastically when they found out our house would be blocking part of their sea view. They caused us hell during the whole building process, trying to take us to court for any minor thing they thought could stop the building process. When we eventually moved in we found they were really keeping up with the Jones type people. When they saw we were building a pool they built a pool. When they figured out I was going to a pretty expensive school they started sending their son there too, etc. I'm also pretty sure they even had another kid just to compete with us. Their only son then was about 17. We had a pretty young family where my youngest sister was 4. They were also really violent. The mother used to always threaten us, the kids, that she'd make their dog attack us. I was pregnant and they always had a problem with us mowing our yard. Because we didn't mow the same time as them. We did it every other weekend and just so happened to not line up with theirs. The day after I had my child we came home to the yard having been mowed. Okay. No problem. Maybe they were being nice since they knew we had been at the hospital. Nope. They came over 2 hours after we had been home with our newborn, saying we now owed them $40 for mowing our yard. My husband laughed, said we didn't even know, much less agree to that, and slammed the door in the old man's face. Fuck those people. I had this one downstairs neighbor that lacked any respect for the fact that our building wasn't sound insulated. He would listen to loud music mostly through the day and sometime late at night. I'm a patient person. Tried to ask them to be careful. Or sometime banged on the floor when I just wanted to sleep. This lasted for months. But nothing had yet been done with the landlord. One day though I think he discovered that he really loved Gnarls Barkley's Crazy and he decided it was appropriate to play it half a dozen times in the course of an hour. And I just heard it. I really blew it. So, being a karaoke jockey and having my equipment on hand, I decided to show him what loud was. I connected my speakers to my computer through my console. Then I went hunting for the absolute worst karaoke cover of that same song. I remember vividly it was this creepy fat basement dweller in his late 40s dedicating the cover to a random 14-year-old girl on the internet. And it was horribly off tune. The voice was this annoying falsetto. So I played it, with the speakers flat on the floor so he'd get the full brunt of it. I played it 3 times in a row loud enough that he would definitely suffer the consequence of his lack of respect. And, wouldn't you know it, he never played that song again and he started being much more conservative in his volume levels. He left that summer and I never heard Crazy again from his collection. I wonder why. This touches a nerve. 1. The day I moved in, grouchy old man next door shows up at my door to tell me my backyard slope causes his yard to get water where he doesn't want water. 2. Grouchy old man's even grouchier old wife screams at the landscaper because some of my grass clippings blew into her yard. She was literally picking up blades and throwing them back into my yard, like individual blades. 3. My house was a neglected foreclosure so I had a lot of workmen here after moving in. Grouchy M's Nosy would tell each and every one of them they weren't allowed to park in front of her house. She complained to every tradesman who was here. Complaints were all ridiculous. 4. Put up a net batting cage in backyard. Yep. She complained she didn't like how it looked from her side of the wall. I said, too bad. Yay. No her here. I can have anything I want on my property. And can paint my house yellow. Which she complained about too, of course. And on it's gone for 9 years. Well, lo and behold, a few days ago a for sale popped up in their yard. Now there's a sale pending sign. Christmas came early this year. Oh happy day. Our neighbor wanted to put up a fence and had the property line surveyed. Turns out our driveway extended about 6 inches over her property line. We found out when we came home one day and she had a jackhammer taking off 6 inches of our driveway. There wasn't anything we could really do despite that being incredibly annoying. She built her fence directly on the property line against our driveway. We bang car doors on her fence all the time because we have kids and they have almost no space to get out. She gets mad if something of ours touches her fence because she wants to keep it nice since it was expensive. She yelled at my husband a few weeks ago about having a pile of rocks too close to her fence. He told her that her tree overhangs our driveway and drops leaves and branches all the time. He started gathering them up and dropping them in her yard. He has considered taking a chainsaw and just cutting down the limbs that cross our property line. My family has owned a cottage on one of the Finger Lakes in western New York for 18 years. About 6 years ago, a small convenience store opened up at the top of the hill above our cottage. At first, it was an awesome perk because we no longer needed to drive 20 minutes into town if we forgot anything, and the store had awesome sandwiches. We quickly became friends with the owner of the store, who was just an all-around awesome dude. After his store grew more and more popular, he decided to put a bar on the back of his store and blast live music off his back deck. Our neighbors, sweet little 80-year-old Jewish couple, complained saying they didn't want the bar on the back of the store as it devalued their property and the music was way too loud. The store owner went off the deep end. He called them Jewish slurs, kicked them out of the store and just made their lives living hell. My father saw what was going on and stuck up for our neighbors, and we were also getting a little sick of the bar and its obnoxious customers. The store owner did the same thing to our family that he did to our neighbors. Being the stubborn bastard that he is, my dad fought back and found that the store owner has violated some zoning laws in the creation of his bar. It got shut down, thus starting a massive war between my dad and the store owner. The store owner found that he owned about 5 feet of lawn in front of our cottage that we maintained for 18 years, and cut down the trees and left 6 feet stumps on our yard. He refuses to let us park cars there and leaves garbage cans with no purpose just sitting there. My dad took a stake out of the lawn and the owner called the police and tried to have him arrested. It's starting to get so bad that the entire town knows about this food, and my dad was actually just interviewed by the Wall Street Journal about it. Dirty creep of a neighbor. Bob used to knock his wife around. One night we hear her being slammed against walls and punched, so we called the cops. Usual story of her denying everything while we are over the fence counter arguing with her and Bob to the coppers. Cops couldn't do anything, so they left. Bob flashes his victory smirk as Whiffy is hustled inside. After that, Bob made a point of being in his yard every time we were so he could suggest sexual acts he'd love to do on 2 young fit women. We'd hurl abuse back, but all it resulted in was that shit-eating punchable smirk. He'd leer and grab himself every time we would mow the lawn, which resulted in us tipping all clippings into his yard, which resulted in him threatening us with the same treatment his wife received. The final confrontation occurred when Bob made the choice to enter our property. Unbeknown to Bob, we had called the cops just before he entered, as his catcalling and threats were escalating to a point where we felt genuinely afraid instead of just disgusted and uncomfortable. Cops turn up just as Bob is heading up the stairs yelling his soon-to-be actions. He gets hauled away, never to be seen at his house again. Turns out Bob was not only a creep but one on a good behavior bond. His wife moved out not long after. In all the time they lived there, the only time we heard her speak was a final downcast goodbye as she walked out her yard and hopefully into a new happy life without Bob. Over 30 years ago, when I was in my late 20s and single, I moved into a flat below a married couple in the Scottish borders. Over the first few months I could hear constant loud shouting and swearing, principally from the husband, as they were arguing. Finally, one Friday night about 10 p.m, I could hear the sound of the wife being struck repeatedly. I didn't know what to do, but after about 10-15 minutes of screaming and what sounded like slapping and kicking, I decided to go up to their door. I knocked the door, and when it was opened I saw the wife lying on the floor bleeding around the mouth and face. Before I could say anything, the husband shouted and swore at me and spat in my face, then slammed the door. I experienced a sipple haze, so I stormed down the stairs to my flat and grabbed the first thing inside the door. Probably fortunately it was my squash racket, wooden. It was over 30 years ago. I went back upstairs and hammered on the door. When it was opened this time, I gave him a full-blooded blow to the face and down he went. I then stood over him, screaming and inviting him to get back up. Thankfully, he didn't shot us. By then I think I had completely lost control. My parting shot as I left, mainly because of my anger, was to tell him if he laid a finger on the wife again, I would be back. I never spoke to either again and understood from other sources they separated very soon after. My squash was never the same again. I was only a kid, but when my family began laying the foundations for an above-ground pool in the backyard, my dad thought it would be funny to pull a prank on my neighbor across the street. We had moved in a year or two before, and my neighbor had always said that she thought the guy who lived there before us was a little odd. So, with all the digging in the backyard, my dad called her up and proceeded to tell her they found a skull. He let her go on for 10 minutes about how she always knew something was up before telling her he was just messing around. Though we're incredibly close with them, I would have been so mad if that had been me on the other end. I had a neighbor whose dog stayed out all night, and it barked. All night. I mean all night. I couldn't sleep very much. It was making me crazy. I went over to talk to them after I got off my shift one night. It was about 11 PM and the dog had just started up its nightly routine. They came to the door in pajamas, so apparently they could sleep through it. I told them it was keeping me from doing my job well, as I was terribly sleep deprived. I told them I can't use earplugs all night, as I had some ear injuries from playing rugby, and why should I have to anyway? I begged them to somehow stop the dog from barking all night. Bring it in. Put on a shock collar. Anything. Nope. So one night I decided to take matters into my own hands. I put on my black clothing, use my army face paint to camo my face and arms. Then I grabbed my super soaker and crawl across the yard at like 2 AM. I set up the shot and waited. Soon as the dog started in barking, I hit it with a nice stream of water. I only had to do that 3 nights in a row until he finally stopped. The first house my wife and I bought was in an established neighborhood where the neighbors were all friends. Went out to the garage to smoke one night around 2 AM. and heard a loud crack against my garage door. So I snuck around the back of my house around the side to see what was going on. I see my neighbors across the street and my next door neighbors all lined up drinking and throwing eggs at my house. So I calmly walk out to my driveway where they can see me and proceed to call the cops on them while they watch. They tried to convince me not to and that they would clean it all up, but I refused. Told them they were cleaning it up regardless and that the cops could document their issue in case this continued to happen. Turns out, after a night of drinking, they got upset that we moved into the house their friends used to live in, which was sold willingly. Wasn't even a foreclosure. I eventually forgave them about a year later, but it was a shitty welcome to the hood. The day after we moved into our new home, our neighbor poked her head over the backyard fence and said, "I hope you're gonna cut down that tree." The tree in question was a 50-foot, 50-year-old gorgeous maple. I really didn't know what to say. I guess I just mumbled something. She kept up the same question for a few years. She didn't like the tree because the leaves got into her pool. Never mind that her backyard is surrounded by other trees, too. Well, one day I happened to glance out my kitchen window, which faces the back. There was a truck with a cherry picker on her side of the fence prepping to cut a huge split limb off the tree. The limb was actually half of the tree. So I screamed at him to stop and the neighbor cursed me. That was a big mistake. I called the cops and said the magic words, "Neighbor dispute." They showed up in 2 minutes and kicked the guy and his truck off the neighbor's property and told her not to do it again. We haven't spoken in about 20 years and it's no loss to me. I think the worst neighbor we ever had was an old next door neighbor to us in an apartment. It started the day we moved in. To get to our apartment from the parking lot, you had to take a narrow footbridge as you entered on the second floor of the apartment. She yelled at us because we parked our truck in front of said walkway so we could unload. She came home yelling about how that and the space next to it was hers and we had to move the truck now. Okay. No big deal except we were told there was 0 assigned parking and 0 spaces left for our truck. Not to mention, she was parked in Sarah's other space and lived alone so only had 1 car. She called the office and they sent security and told her the space wasn't hers just because she wanted it and they have never had assigned parking. Apparently this made her mad. She made it her mission to make us miserable. She constantly called the office on us for noise complaints even though we're literally be doing nothing. Eventually the complex got tired of it and called the actual cops. They asked us what we were doing and we told them we were sitting on the opposite side of the apartment playing a game. She admitted to the cops that the only reason she could hear us is because she had her ears pressed against the wall. Luckily, the cops didn't appreciate them being called out for a non-existent noise complaint and issued her a ticket. Never had a problem with her again.